white in that context. They thought of themselves as, Irish maybe, or Jewish maybe, or, Catholic maybe in a largely Protestant community, but they did not think of themselves as white. And the same thing was true for my white students. One of the things that I used to do at the beginning of the semester was to ask my students to describe themselves. And I remember sitting in a classroom having, maybe 25 students. We were all sitting in a big circle. We were going around, and I asked the students to describe themselves really in any way that they wanted to, but then I asked them to describe themselves in the context of their race and ethnicity, and to talk a little bit about why they were taking the class. And I remember one young white woman in the class, when it came to her, she was kind of stuck. She didn't know how to describe herself, and she said, "I'm just normal." And that notion of being the norm was part of her experience of being white. She wasn't used to thinking of herself as white. She was just like everybody else. She'd grown up in a mostly, if not entirely, white community. And that was the idea that she had to think about herself in terms of her race or ethnicity in the context of our discussion was uncomfortable. But one of the things, and that discomfort, one of the things I learned as an instructor was that discomfort could interfere with people's ability to learn new information. It's as though when your anxiety level is high, it's hard to take in new information. It's hard to remember things if you're stressed, right? And I found that when my students were really confronted with information that was new to them, that they weren't used to thinking about, it raised their anxiety to a point that it was hard for them to take in the new information. And that I, as an instructor, had to do something to lower the level of anxiety. There are a lot of different ways that I did that. Some of it was asking students to write in journals. Some of it was having them pair up and talk in small groups. There are a lot of different ways, pedagogical strategies that I used. But I learned pretty quickly that if I didn't do those things, my students would not learn the information I wanted them to know. They just couldn't take it in. And I also understood that the experience of white students in my class was different than the experiences of students of color. That everybody was learning something new, and even some of the students of color were not necessarily used to thinking of themselves in race or ethnic terms, depending on where they had grown up or what their backgrounds were, and certainly not everybody had the same experience. There's a lot of diversity of experience. But what I did come to understand was that regardless of background, that everyone needed to understand what I refer to in my book, and perhaps you will remember it, as the cycle, right? That there's a cycle of isms operating. Cycle of oppression, cycle of racism, cycle of sexism, cycle of anti-Semitism, cycle of heterosexism. You pick your ism. There's a cycle that is operating that has to do with the misinformation we take in early in our lives and that we internalize as part of the growing up experience. Some of that misinformation is about people different from ourselves. Some of that information is about people like ourselves. One piece of information that my white students often took in was that they were individuals and not members of, that people didn't see them as members of a group. But of course, if you are a member of a targeted group, you do tend to notice. Women notice when a man walks in the room, men notice when a woman walks in the room, and that's not about, sexual attraction, it's about just noticing dimensions of someone's identity. And in that sense, recognizing how this cycle operates and where you fit in it, what is your place in it, based on your own demographic characteristics, is an important piece of learning that we all sooner or later have to come to terms with. For many students, being in the class called Psychology of Racism was the first time, this is what my UC Santa Barbara students were telling me, this is the first time I've really been able to think about this and talk about it. And that in itself is a very powerful experience. But I also learned that it was hard to do. It was hard to do in that you had to create safe spaces where it could happen. One of the things that I did, And I often, not only did I teach this class, but the class sort of opened doors for me to do trainings, workshops for people, organizations, not unlike this one. And sometimes I would do those workshops with a partner. I worked very closely with a white woman whose name is Andrea Avazian, and she and I would do these workshops together sometimes. And we would have a room full like this, and we might have spent a couple days with people, and might be a racially mixed group. This group gathered here today is certainly a diverse group, but by definition made up of people of color. But when we did these workshops where we had both whites and people of color together, we would sometimes do something where we would divide the group. You know, we'd spend some time together, but then we would divide the group. And the white people would go with my co-facilitator, Andrea, and the people of color would come with me, and we would have dialogue about issues related to the conversations we've been having in the workshops. What was very interesting about that, and maybe this will not surprise you, what was very interesting about that was that the people of color were often very happy to have this time together. You know, they often had things that they wanted to talk about with each other that they felt more comfortable talking about with each other than in the large group. The white participants were often uncomfortable during that time. And my colleague Andrea would often say that they spent a great deal of time in their group together speculating about what the other group was talking about. Meanwhile, I can tell you that in my many years of experience facilitating the people of color group, they never spent any time talking about what is the other group talking about. You know, it was a very different kind of experience. And so one of the things that I had to work with my students, all of my students, was that there is benefit in time together, but there's also benefit in time apart. And that part of the work that my white colleague Andrea would do with the white participants was to really help them think about what did it mean to be white in the context of this gathering. What did it mean to be white as an ally? What does it mean to be a white ally? What does it mean to really own your identity and the meaning that it has for other people? And sit with that and feel okay about it. And for the people of color, there was often a lot of dialogue about what does it mean to have to sometimes be patient with people who are struggling with those kinds of issues. You know, even as you're struggling with your own, because we all have, as I mentioned, misinformation, not only about people different from ourselves, but also about people like ourselves. And I can say, you know, as an African American, I might feel like, well, okay, yeah, I got misinformation about other black women or African American women, but that doesn't mean I didn't also get misinformation about Latinos or Asians or Native Americans or, you know, people of Arab descent. There are lots of ways in which we all have work to do. But the challenge is, how do we create the spaces where the work can take place? And that is really one of the things that is exciting to me about this gathering, is that Teach for America is creating a space where this work can take place for all of you. I don't know, but I would hope that a similar space is being created for white participants, because white participants also have an opportunity, need an opportunity to talk about what does it mean to be white in the context of the work we're doing for Teach for America. And that's a hard conversation to have in a mixed setting. But it's an important conversation. So I note that Susan is writing this down. I really think it's an important conversation to have. But whether we're having a mixed conversation or a separate conversation, I think it's important to remember what I refer to, and depending on which version of my book you have read, if you've read like the most recent, at the end I talk about the ABCs. A, affirming identity, B, building community, C, cultivating leadership. It seems to me that whenever we are working in the kind of work, in the education space and the kind of work